Hello everyone, it's Mythion here. Going to give you a Total War Warhammer 2 Norscan unit roster tier list. Basically, I'm going to be ranking these units based on kind of where their power level is and sort of explaining some of their applications, maybe some matchups, kind of giving you a brief generic use of how to use them. Um, it'd just be kind of like a fun little video for me. I'm going to have fun doing it. Hopefully you have fun watching it. And I plan on doing one of these for every faction within the next couple of weeks or so. We actually got Total War Warhammer 3 dropping out tomorrow, and I'm super excited for that. And I've realized, I really want to get one of these out for every faction for a couple of reasons. Number one, I sort of want to eternalize it and sort of self-document it. I can always, if I make these videos, I can always go back and see, okay, this is where everything was at the end of Total War Warhammer 2. Because the meta is going to change. There's going to be new mechanics. There could be rebalancing. The different factions are going to demand different units. So some things that were thought of as weak before could potentially rise up. That sort of thing. It's going to be really interesting to see how all that goes down. So I just want to document it. Also, I just need practice making videos. I need practice speaking clearly, explaining my opinions clearly. What better way to do it than with a fun way like this? And of course, the final reason is just, like I said, it's going to be a lot of fun for me. So hopefully you enjoy it as well. As far as the tier list is concerned, it's going to be for multiplayer. Now, generally, I play campaign head to head. There's a couple of real life friends I play with, a couple of people on a couple of multiplayer servers, like Turns multiplayer server that I've played with. Um, I enjoy that a lot more because you get kind of the best of both worlds. You get all the cool things of campaign with dealing with a real player, which can be really exciting and intense at times. So that's sort of my perspective. It's going to bleed in, obviously, to regular multiplayer ladder as well, which has hard gold caps. Um, so there'll be some discrepancies. For example, I'm kind of judging everything where it fits in like an actual 20 stack, whereas, in ladder, gold efficiency is still a higher premium because you often can't have a 20 stack, right? Now, I still take gold into account. It'll still have some similarities, but I just want to make that distinction of sort of what perspective I'm coming from. Total War Warhammer 3 is supposed to have a couple of multiplayer campaigns designed around multiplayer, so we'll see how that goes. I'm excited for that. But anyway, let's get into Norsca itself. Now, Norsca is probably the most aggressive faction in the game, which might be surprising to you. You might think Vampire Counts or Warriors of Chaos might actually, or even Beastmen might be, more aggressive, because Norsca at least has some missile play to it. But the thing is, Warriors of Chaos is a lot slower, a lot more heavily armored. They tend to play a more deathball sort of style. They want to blob up. Vampire Counts as well tends to want a death ball and blob up. They're not necessarily super aggressive. Both of those can play that style, but Vampire Counts is a lot more attrition based. They have a lot of ways to drain your HP, and they have summons to wear you down, and they have tons and tons of healing. So those factions play a lot slower than Norsca does. So while Norsca has some missile elements to it, it's a much more faster, much more aggressive faction, and it's a great faction for beginners as well because it'll teach you the fundamentals of playing aggressive if you want to do an aggressive, play style. Norsca has been considered for several years now as a great tournament pick. If you play on for like Turin's multiplayer stuff or some other people, or if you just want to play on ladder, Norsca is a great pick because it doesn't really have hard counter matchups. It has great coverage, great things it can bring to the table against all kinds of different factions, and it's a very proactive strategy, right? So it's a little less reliant on knowing everyone else's faction to the teeth and having like the perfect counters to it. Norsca brings the game plan to the table, so to speak. So I think it's a great faction for beginners, and really all it needs is Total War Warhammer 2 is just a slightly more fun campaign. But other than that, their roster is actually in a great spot. So we'll start with infantry. You have your low tier Marauder units. We have 3 different variants: Axe and Board, a Spearman unit, which is unshielded, unfortunately, and a Great Weapon variant. So the best one is the generic Axe and Shield. It just has the best stats. I'm going to put it in below average. Just has the best stats overall. The fact that it has bronze shields is a big deal. I'm really low on infantry that don't have shields. Um, you need something in your roster that can absorb missiles. And um, the reason why they're in below average as opposed to being higher is just the stats themselves are pretty bad. Even in low tiers, they're not necessarily that amazing. But its one saving grace is that it does have the rage passive, which kind of roids it up over time. So they can contribute into like the third, fourth quarter kind of thing more than you might expect with that low leadership. But overall, it's not an amazing unit. You just kind of use these guys to get you through the early game, and that's pretty much it. Their two variants are more specialized and ultimately end up being a lot weaker. I'm gonna put both the Spearman and the Great Axe just in weak, and I'll talk about why. So the Spearmen, both strategically, as far as what Norsca wants to do, and as a Spearman unit compared to other Spearman units, is just not that good. Comparing it to other Spearman units, most spears in this game have shields. You think of even like generic goblins or like Empire, they can absorb some missile play. The Marauder Spearmen, no shield, so they get blasted by missiles. They probably can't be on the front line. Their really only niche is being kind of in the reserve or on the flanks, really just trying to prevent calf play from, surrounding and overwhelming and getting rear charges off on you. Now, even though I put them in weak, in the early game, if you go up against that Surtha guy, and he's building a bunch of chariots, or the guy that you're playing head to head against is building a lot of cav or chariots, obviously spearmen can contribute. They'll do just fine in that situation. But they really have to be going up against large. If they're going up against anything other than large, they're a terrible unit. And against large, I'm not gonna try and sell you that they're great there. Like, they're just acceptable. So it's a weak unit. And then finally, the Great Axe variant. You sacrifice your bronze shield and 8 melee defense for armor piercing. And this faction, first of all, it's like you get this guy early, and the only faction that you would ever fight that you really need the armor piercing is against Krakadrak. I guess against Krakadrak is the only reason why he's not very weak, because yeah, he can do well against the dwarves there, but you just don't need him. You're facing other Norskins. There's going to be very little armor on the field. Um, and even when you eventually get to the point where, like tier 3, tier 4, kind of in the mid game, transitioning to the late game, you get tons and tons of both armor piercing options and armor sundering options. Armor sundering is fairly common in the faction. Plus, you have Lore of Metal to drop armor, so even against armor, I would argue that regular Marauders are probably going to be slightly better. I mean, they're going to survive longer with higher melee defense, which means they're going to get more benefit from their rage. And like I said, there's tons of ways for you to deal with armor rather than just bringing straight armor piercing on an unshielded infantry unit. So I'm really down on Marauder Great Weapons. I almost never build them. Halfway tempted to put them in very weak, but I'm trying to keep very weak as just terrible, atrocious units, and I guess Marauder Great Weapons do have the Crack-a-Jack application, or if you just happen to be facing armor and can only build low-tier units, I guess it has that application, so there it is. So in the mid-tier, we got champions, and in their elite tier, essentially, is the champions. Or sorry, we got berserkers in the mid-tier, and champions as the elite, basically. And berserkers are incredibly strong. Incredibly strong. Kind of a defining unit of the faction. This class typically isn't very good. There's not a lot of really good dual-wielding infantry units. They're unshielded, which means they get blasted by missiles. They're vulnerable to charges because they don't have any sort of like charge defense. Their low melee defense means that chaff actually trades up into them. You don't want these guys fighting like goblin spears, even though they'll mulch them down, obviously. They'll take too much damage for it to be worth it. That being said, these are some incredibly killy units. They're kind of like Slayers, where you kind of have to coddle them a little bit. They're not good on the front line, but they're an incredibly powerful win condition for you and can rack up just hundreds upon hundreds of kills. Um, One thing I like to do, sometimes you'll want them sort of not, you'll want them kind of in the flank, and you'll sort of use magic to sort of like blast the line, wear them down, and then the Zerkers will connect, kill them really quickly, and then just overwhelm the back line. Because you need to threat overload as Norsca, right? Um, in fact, let me demonstrate this here real quick. I kind of want to explain this with. We'll go to paint here real quick. Don't worry, my artistic skills are legendary. So let's say you got your standard Norscan front line is usually 5 wide, which is a wide front line, even for a 20 stack. Um, so we'll say that those gray lines are champions and that these are berserkers, right? Let's just say they're sort of on the flank. So that is your 5-man front line, okay? And you got like your cav units and stuff. It doesn't matter what type they are. The concepts will be the same. Let's say you're fighting Empire. Empire is almost always going to bring a 4-man front line and 3 units in the reserve. This is stock standard for a 20 stack on most Empire players that have played in head-to-head. Let's say they got some gunslingers. And you'll just have to imagine that they're spaced out properly, but I'm just trying to draw some concepts here. So, on your approach, you want your cav to wrap around, right? And like your fast units. It could even be like Wolfkin and stuff. But they have enough peel here that they can match this. Even if you split up and you got wolves going all over the place, they have tons and tons of peel. So what you got to do, these berserkers is sort of like your point of attack. You absolutely need to penetrate up the middle. You can't just rely on swarming against good players. Good players are going to peel. They're going to be able to screen out any sort of speed that you bring to the table. You have to be able to punch up the middle. So these berserkers sort of give you an idea where your game plan could be. Because champions, which are phenomenal units that we'll get to, they're not that great at killing things. They're just more good like sustained damage, slow and grindy. So I would often cast, maybe I'll cast like a burning head here, right? Or like a pendulum here or something like that. Try to blast them a little bit, even both of these, but one or other, just depending on how far they out. Good players will spread out their lines to where you can't get a lot of value off of damaging spells, but whatever. Let's just say it's this one, right? And then this is where you'd line up your units. You got champion, 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 and then this is where your overload happens. And what this does, they're already weakened, they're getting overwhelmed. This is going to collapse in a hurry. Berserkers are incredibly killing units, and within 10, 15, 20 seconds of that initial frontline engagement, you're already bursting through, and your berserkers are causing a bunch of havoc in the back line, right? And if they bring peel, which is what they need to do, that opens up your flanking play. So Norsca, this is what I'm talking about when it's good for new players to learn aggressive things. It teaches you these concepts, how to swarm and overload, right? And you can play with this sort of alignment. I'm a big advocate of 2 berserkers, 3 champions for Norsca for frontline. It's tried and true. I've been doing it for years. I encourage you to try it and practice some of these against some of your players who like to play elves, empire, or dwarves. Very regimented, very clean, organized formations with good missile play. I encourage you to play Norsca and just practice just busting those guys up. So let me do a new one here. Don't save it. Okay, same concept. So you can play around where you have your berserker play. So let's say I have 2 berserkers in the middle and a champion on the outside and 2 champions here on the outside. You don't want to do the same thing over and over because eventually your opponents will catch on. Your friends will catch on, whoever you play with. So let's just do the same line here. I know, like I said, my artistic skills are pretty legendary. Let's say these are like handgunners. They got some like artillery back here, spaced out properly. You'll just have to imagine it. And you got your calf play that wants to wrap around, obviously. You got wolves, you got marauder horsemen. They want to get in here and they want to start messing stuff up. Well, again, here's your 2 berserkers. So Where are your damaging spells going? Right here. This is your point of attack. Right dead, almost dead center, so to speak. So you line up your champion, everything's collapsing in. These are champions. They're just gonna do a sustained combat and sort of win that over time. Champions are nice that there's something you don't have to micro. And this is your point of attack for your berserkers right here. You get your berserkers in. If they peel, like I said, well, what if they peel here? Well, that is going to open up flanking play. Those missiles are going down. As Norsca, if they get more than a minute of their missiles, you're doing something wrong. And I don't mean to tell you that to make you feel bad. I'm saying that you just need to absolutely practice getting in there and busting those missiles up. Once those missiles are disrupted or gone, then come in the mammoths to clean up and absolutely decimate. Because if you charge in the mammoths first, against good players who have focus fire, plus with like army buffs and like lord buffs, mammoths actually drop in seconds. They really do. Good players will absolutely delete them. So you have to disrupt their counter to your mammoths first. And if you do that, your mammoths are just gonna be a win condition that they can't deal with. So hopefully that kind of, I know my art looks like a bunch of 5-year-old scribbles, but hopefully I'm getting a few things to you. And the most thing I would suggest is try mixing champion and berserker front lines, and try switching the positions of where your champions are and trying out different things and seeing what works for you. Because you don't want to have the same alignment all the time. That's not necessarily that good. Okay. Back to our little tier list here. So berserkers, generally speaking, with good play, they're going to rack up hundreds of kills for you. Very high damage unit. Sort of facilitates, like I said, where your point of attack is. But, it's not one of those things that you want to just set into the front line and forget about or not have any support. Like these things, these things aren't necessarily... They're good in melee versus melee engagements, but their low defenses means that they'll take a lot of damage as well. So, like I said, it's a win con if used correctly. Now, champions, I mentioned I like to do a 3 champion, 2 berserker frontline. So more champions. That might make you think that I would put them higher, but I'd actually just put them at above average, even though you use more of them. It's just a role player, as opposed to berserkers, which are more of a win condition. That's sort of my logic here. Berserkers have really good melee, champions have really good melee defense, bronze shields, high armor. They still have the rage passive, so they still roid up over time. Just a good, solid unit. But not really a win condition, not really something that people look at Norsca and say, oh yeah, those Marauder champions are like a defining part of their faction. No, it's just an above average unit, but a bit of a role player, so I appreciate him for that. And then we have the Great Weapon Champion variant, which I'm going to put as below average, actually. Kind of the same problems with the Great Weapon Marauder. You're not looking, they don't do the job of berserkers as far as killing things go. Not even close. They're giving up their shields. Yeah, they have a lot more armor, but a lot of people are going to bring armor piercing against you anyways, and they lose out. I think they lose out on 21 melee defense. Yeah, I think it's like 53 to 41 or 40, or it's 53 to 32. Don't quote me on that. It's something crazy like that. I think they lose 21 melee defense and shields for armor piercing. And as far as front lines go, like I said, I'm really down on losing shields, losing defensive stats like melee defense on frontliners. They sort of fulfill the role of berserkers, but significantly less, and thus are just kind of like completely pushed out of the meta, unfortunately. Alright, so missile infantry. Now, Norsca missile infantry is pretty terrible, obviously. But the javelin unit has some applications, especially in the early game. So these guys do decent against throwing their javelins into large targets. They do relatively okay damage. It's more good against Norsca than like other factions though, because Norsca, they're large units. If you think of like trolls mammoths, a giant, whatever the case is often like in the blob, not on the flank. Their 90 range means that they can't chase and actually like shoot down cav that are constantly charging in and out. Um, they're only good against mammoths against AI players because they'll just leave them in the blob and then you can focus them down. But this is against players where, oh, you got your javelins coming up. Well, I'll just bring my mammoth out of there, right? And what's going to really surround and hold down a mammoth? Nothing, especially in the early game. So against players, this unit really is just kind of terrible. But I can't put it in very weak because it does have that. It technically can be that sustained damage you need against large targets. And then there's the throwing X variant, which is just terrible. It has some AP and shield breaker, but the problem is it's like when is this gonna apply? Because if you're if they let's say that you're going up against dwarves and they have like shielded front line, which is like heavily armored, which where you'd think these guys would be good. So you bring them up, with their 80 range or something, virtually melee range to try and get some chip damage onto their front line. But they have missile play that will absolutely Shrek these guys. The only application where these guys can succeed is if they have no missiles at all and it's like a very melee focused fight, well, then these guys can kind of flank around and get missile play. And because the enemy has no speed and no missiles, okay, sure, yeah, then they can rack up a lot of damage. But there's almost always going to be something like that, even at tiers 1 and 2. And as far as speed goes, like Half can just come in and just wreck these guys anyway. So very just a not very functional unit at all. Their missile damage is not bad, but with the range combined with the fact that like Norsca just doesn't support this playstyle. They don't want to be missile blobbing anyways. Think of it. If you want to try and use these guys, think of them as like free company militia. Like have them on the flanks, set up shooting lanes, and then afterwards they can go into melee. And they have decent melee attack, terrible melee defense. But like I said, if you're on the flank, maybe you can get a surround or whatever. So yeah, I definitely use them for time to time to change them up. You can make them work, but by and large, I would say it's one of the worst units in the game, honestly. All right, so Norscan infantry, fairly below average. Like I said, I pretty much stick to 3 champions, 2 berserkers, pretty much all the time. It's like I said, it's tried and true for me. So those 2 units in particular are much higher. I think they're actually good. Most of the other stuff, though, just leaves a lot to be desired. There's too many functional things wrong with them. Couple of Regiment of Renown. The Marauder Regiment of Renown has perfect vigor. That's not enough for it to bump it to average. Perfect vigor is really good on infantry, but the Marauder just doesn't make use of the stats of perfect vigor that much. It's gonna kick for a little bit longer. It'll probably do a little bit more damage, but you're really not doing anything amazing with this unit. Yeah, it's if you want it, you want it. And then finally we have the Unbreakable Marauder Berserker, which is such a power. Unbreakable is insane on this guy. I'm gonna have to put it in. Well, he's still a dual-wielding, unshielded infantry. Yeah, well, I'll just keep him in strong. Definitely an upgrade, but the fact that it's unbreakable, fighting to the last man, probably going to net tons and tons of kills, like I said. It's a rank 9 berserker, but it's really hard for infantry to be getting the very strong for me. Infantry in this game is relatively weak. I think that's fair to say. But fantastic unit. Big win con. Alright, so a category that Norsca has a ton of options for is monstrous infantry. Monstrous infantry, you typically want sort of charging right behind the main frontline force, surrounded by more units. That way they can't be surrounded because they have less entities, right? So they tend to get messed up hard just purely as a front line. Like a pure front line of monstrous infantry is not that good, especially on the holding end of things. but they're really good, when supported. Like I said, if you go with like champions and berserkers, a lot of times I'll go with like 2 or 3 regiments of monstrous infantry of some kind. Norsca has 3 basically, I'll call them classes of it. You have trolls, you have Famir, and you have Wolfkin. Wolfkin and Famir are fantastic units. Trolls, on the other hand, I'm just gonna put them into straight very weak. Just the problem is the only faction that really uses trolls well is greenskins, because greenskins have a lot better ways of like granting immune to psychology, with some of their lords, or they have like poison or something else to sort of facilitate it, or goblin spears are a cheap way to really uh, add a lot of protection to trolls. You think silver shields and like low entity count with like a high entity count unit, and no shields and weak to missiles. It's like a perfect synergy there. Norskins don't really want to use their Marauder Spearmen, so using it to cover for these guys is not that ideal. And trolls are just, what do they bring to the table that you can't get with Wolfkin and Famir? If you want sustained combat damage and tankiness, you're going to go with Famir for the armor sundering, for the high combat stats, for the armor. If you need something for a bit more of a hit and run style, something that can contribute a little bit more on the flank but also do good in the blob, you're going to do with Wolfkin, which are just more versatile. Trolls have much worse combat stats. They have terrible leadership. Uh, they're just terrible units on this roster. I can never recommend them. It's funny, you might say, well, Throg boosts trolls. He does boost trolls a lot. Most of the stuff that boosts trolls boosts other monstrous infantry, though. At least Famir. And I tried Throg's troll stack. I thought it still did much worse than Throg's Famir stack. So, I guess. I mean, it's decent in Throg's army with his buffs, but I don't know. Overall, the unit is just a terrible unit. You really want to stick to Wolfkin and Famir, and just avoid trolls. Now, the conversation between Wolfkin and Famir is an interesting one. Like I said, Famir do much better in the death ball, sort of on the front line. They put out a lot more damage than Wolfkin do, and they're a lot tankier. And they have armor sundering. However, they do not have regen, and they have much worse speed. So, if you have like your Ice Wolves out fighting some Empire Cav, right, and you kind of need to get them down, your Ice Wolves are not going to win that. Wolfkin can actually peel away, and they have enough speed generally to get there and actually mess those Empire Cav up. And the Empire aren't going to be able to get away because they're permanently frostbitten, right? So there's a lot more versatility with Wolfkin. Wolfkin really are like the defining unit of their famous hit and run playstyle. You'll have to kind of, it might be a faction specific thing, or just a playstyle thing, depending on how you play Norsca. Lately, I've been tailoring more to Famir over Wolfkin, just because I feel like Norsca is slowly getting pushed more and more into the Deathball playstyle as other factions get updated more and more and whatnot. But I think both are fantastic units. And I'm going to put... Now, as far as the variants of Wolfkin themselves, you have an unarmored, or a very light armor, regular variant that has 10 more speed, I believe. And then you have the armored one. They give up 10 speed and they get a bunch more armor. In multiplayer, the speed is usually better. But it's not enough of a difference to where, you can really like say one is a higher tier or the other. I mean, you do get a lot of armor with the armored variant, and it can just kind of depend on if you're hitting a certain speed breakpoint to actually make it to a critical engagement, or if you have an armor breakpoint to where whatever unit it's fighting doesn't have armor piercing and ends up doing considerably better. So really, they're kind of on the same level. I'll put them in above average. They are fantastic units. Now, the Famir has the Great Weapon variant and the regular variant. The Great Weapon variant, I believe, has anti-large. Let me actually check that real quick. Because don't actually remember. Oh, it crashed. Well, that's alright. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it does. So, the Great Weapon ends up having a bit more application, especially in the combination with Champions and Berserkers, like I said, which is sort of my go-to. The Great Weapon complements that a bit more. But the regular variant is also good. I just don't think it has as much synergy because you need a bit more oomph. You need a bit more anti-large in that blob specifically. It kind of depends on what you're fighting. If you're not fighting large, then the warrior is probably better. But like this just covers your weaknesses just a little bit more. So I'll put the regular one. Honestly, there's really not that much. I'm gonna put it above average. I'm gonna put them both in above average because ultimately it just depends on what you're fighting and what your composition needs. So. All right, let's do chariots and missile calf here real quick. So the chariots are we have no unit in average. That's all right. Yeah, chariots are definitely average. In fact, both of them are. If you need a chariot, the Marauder chariot will do just fine for you. The thing is, Norsca doesn't really want to be playing the chariot game most of the time. There are some factions like Lizard Men and Dwarves where it can do like really good at Warriors of Chaos. But generally speaking, you have the sustained combat in your infantry. You have other units that you want on the flank. So you just the chariots aren't necessarily if you need them against certain factions. Other factions they just wouldn't be that good. You know, like against Empire, for example. You might think, oh, chariots would be great because they get in the backline. They do, but Empire infantry is so weak as it is, and this is like hyper specialized in killing infantry. You're really just looking for a bit more speed, um, and a bit more tankiness than what these guys provide. So I would say it's just an average unit. It's not really an exceptional one. As far as the Ice Wolf, real quick, it does have Frostbite, which seems to suggest that it's significantly better. Frostbite on a chariot is just not good. You're gonna have these guys on the flanks like slowing something down. They're terrible in sustained combat on the flanks. Chariots are pretty much predominantly cycle chargers. That's all that they do well. Anything in any other situation, they're terrible in. So having them like slowing something for something else to like catch up and snare. You have Norsca Ice Wolves for that, and who are much smaller and actually even better in sustained combat than the chariot versions are. So to me, it's just a slightly heavier, slightly more combat stats, but more expensive. I'd almost say it's worse, honestly, just because of the payment of it. But they're functionally the same. It's slightly worse than the regular chariot, honestly, surprisingly and honestly, but not enough to drop it a tier. All right, Missile Cav. Very important units for Norsca. This is your primary anti-air. This is part of your flanking disrupting force for disrupting missiles. Very versatile. That they're not amazing in sustained combat against infantry or other cav, but if you need to get in the back line, disrupt an artillery piece, disrupt some missiles, they're great for that. Their missile damage, when combined with skills and other things, actually racks up to quite a bit. I know for a fact one Horsemaster will kill a War Mammoth by itself. So, like a War Mammoth Doom stack would just get hard countered by a Horsemaster Doom stack, so to speak, which is kind of hilarious. Not that I suggest either of those armies, but yeah, it just gives you good coverage. You can't really play the missile game on the ground. So just having these guys on a horse, they can peel for themselves. They can help peel for your backlines. If your flanks get overloaded and they have enemy cav coming in, that could be a disaster. At least these guys are going to damage them on the way and potentially countercharge. Again, it gives you some options. It's very good strategic elements. Now, how good are they in relative to other skirmish cav? And just overall, I wouldn't say they're necessarily amazing. They're more of like the role player category for me. They give you very important functionality against certain things, but not necessarily a hard carry unit. Even though, like I said, one horse master can kill a war mammoth, it takes them like 10 turns to do, or 10 minutes to do so. So I'm not gonna say that it's like a necessarily a win con. So the horse master clearly the best one, I would say. At least has some slightly better stats to make use of rage as well. Sometimes one common thing that is brought against you is Missile Cav. So, Horse Masters in conjunction with the Ice Wolves to slow things down, like Goblin Spider Riders or Outriders or, other Missile Cav, is a really good combination for hunting down and killing off those units. The regular cheap variant, I'm just going to put an average. Very functional unit. You very much appreciate these guys in the early game, but just don't pump out enough damage to rank any higher than that. And then the armor piercing one, I'll put in average as well. Actually, I'll put the initial one in below average. Yeah, that seems about right. With the armor piercing, at least these guys are really good at hunting down armored monsters like dinosaurs and such, steam tanks, that kind of thing, which can potentially have some really good applications. Now, some of their... Oh, we got a regiment around here. The Saws. Oh, yeah, I forgot about these guys. The Maws of Savagery are an armored skin wolf with a very heavy armor-piercing component, and it's just a strict upgrade. But it's still not enough for me to say that it's, like, defining enough. Clearly the best one. It is a regiment of renown, so you only get one of them. But it is obviously like the best in class. It doesn't matter the order of these things, but yeah, the Maws of Savagery, obviously your best wolfkin. Now the Miststalkers, I will put in strong. An exceptional unit. Very much. This is like a staple on the ladder or in like tournament play, for very good reason, and very good in 20 stacks as well. It's basically everything I said about Famir already, but it's just a fantastic unit. Now, okay, so let's do some of these disruption units. So we got 2 wolf variants, Regiment of Renown, and we'll throw in the Pharaoh Manticore in here as well. And then we'll do the Frostworm. Yeah, that's a good order. Alright, wolves, very functional. There's the fastest units on your roster. Good at killing low tier missile infantry. They can struggle against like shades and like sisters and stuff like that, so they actually like fall off pretty hard in the late game because they can't even kill those archer units. They'll just turn around and just like, I guess, use their bows and like slap these wolves to death. But a lot of functionality, a lot of disruption. Even in that situation, at least the sisters aren't firing on your mammoths, right? So, but can they kill things? Nah, debatable. Maybe with like some armor points, some army points or something. But they're not amazing units at killing things. But if you need to disrupt, you need to disrupt, right? It's kind of like the exact same thing as the generic Marauder Horseman. The Beast of Tashnar, the Regiment of Renown, has anti-large, a very impressive anti-large component, actually. These guys are actually really good at hunting down large units. I'll put them in average. They're still a bit flimsy. They still are kind of like, glass cannony, even as a melee unit. But I will say, if you get any other unit on large units, or if they charge you and they get a good charge in, and you surround that, like Empire Knights or whatever, with the Beast of Tashnar, they will tear Cav to pieces. It's actually kind of hilarious. Again, I can't remember the exact value. I believe it's like plus 26 to large, or plus 24, plus 25. It's like it's kind of a nutty value. Ultimately, they will tear Cav to pieces. Not good in a head-to-head engagement though, because like I said, they're sort of like glass cannons. So if the Empire brings their Cav around and you bring your Beast of Tashnar and it's just a head-to-head, it's kind of a wash of who wins, right? And probably even... Yeah, it's probably like a 50-50 at that point. Because the beasts have terrible melee defense, they're also just going to get beat to death. But in any situation where there's already a melee engagement, or if they're cav charge you, or if they're fighting surrounding your monsters or whatever, that's when the Beasts of Tashanar come in. You come in on a rear charge, you deal your damage where they're not taking a lot in return, and that is where they can excel. They're phenomenal at killing that kind of stuff. And then we got Norscan Ice Wolves, which are large. That's an important distinction. A lot of people don't know that Norscan Ice Wolves actually go from small to large, which could be better or worse depending on the situation. Generally, it's considered worse. They have much better sustained combat stats, and they have Frostbite. And I'm just going to say right now, this is a strong unit, actually. You only want one or two of them. Never more, I would say never more than two. But the utility that they provide to be able to get onto things on the flank and snare them, to allow your Wolfkin to get there, to allow your Mammoths to get there, because even Mammoths can get kited by a ton of stuff. To allow, your Horse Masters to get in there. It's critical in dealing with Skirmish Cav. Skirmish Cav is very popular in this game in multiplayer. So you need something that can catch them and snare them. They still have the application of getting into missile units and getting into artillery and tearing them to pieces. And they have better stats, so they'll actually mess up Sisters of Avalorn, for example, as opposed to where the generic wolf variant will just get beat to death in melee, It's kind of embarrassing. So I think it's a phenomenal unit, but I do think that you only want one or two of them. They range from the best unit in your stack with one or two sometimes to in multiples. If you wanted to run 4 or 5, for example, you're just not going to have enough teeth elsewhere to actually do the meaningful sustained damage. So don't overload on these guys, but one or two, like I said, is phenomenal. The Pharaoh Manticore, its application is just the fact that it's a flying unit with fear and terror, which is an incredibly good combination because it's one of the most disruptive units you have, but holy cow, does it always die. Everyone complains about this unit, and for good reason. You go in, it takes even just a little bit of damage, and all of a sudden it's rampaging, and it's just going to suicide. And you can't control it, so you can't even fight the most ideal target sometimes. Sometimes it just... you charge it into a group of artillery, it starts getting focus fired by missiles, and all of a sudden it rampages, and it just goes and attacks the line, and it's doing almost no damage, and you're just like, man, this was just a big chunk of garbage. It's even worse against players than it is against the AI, because players can focus, they know its weaknesses, they will focus it down, they will immediately get rid of it. I just have to put it in very weak. It's strange to do so on a flying terror unit because it's such a good combination, but the rampage and abysmal survivability just absolutely kills this thing. I struggle to get its value worth in damage. I really do. I mean, and anyone will tell you that. It doesn't matter if you're playing against the AI or if you're playing against players in campaign, or if you're playing on the ladder, the vast majority of people will tell you that the Pharaoh Manticore is terrible. And I'm inclined to agree with them. Now, the Frostworm, most people will also tell you is terrible, but I'm here to say that I love the Frostworm. Now, I think the reason why people don't like it is because they're comparing it to the other dragons in the game, and it's not as good as any of the other dragons, like the Chaos Dragon, the Zombie Dragon, and any of the Elven Dragons. It's like the bottom of the barrel as far as that is concerned, just as far as combat potential. But it has incredible utility when you think about it. It's a flyer, so it can still fly over things and be that additional disruptive force. Remember when I was drawing my incredibly well done paint, showing all the different lines, a Frostworm could also be flying overhead. It's all about threat overload with this faction. So as soon as your Berserkers break in, as soon as you get the surround, in comes the Frostworm, just another thing your opponent's shaking his head at. But sometimes you don't even have to go in with this guy. He applies the chilling aura in an AoE, which is amazing. Sometimes he can just be flying overhead, applying a slow to everything. I mean, just think of this guy as a moving blizzard, right? Uh, More often than not, I'll actually have him on the flank, just with the ice wolves, slowing things on the flank because he has 90 speed, so he can actually catch a lot of cav in this game and slow them down and allow other things like Wolfkin and other things to get in, get on those targets, tear them down. Because cav don't want to be fighting Wolfkin; they'll get wrecked most of the time. Um, so I love this unit. I never put more than one in any army. Because for as expensive it is, and its real value to me is the utility, not the combat stats. It is a large single entity, which against players in this game, as a general rule, large single entities aren't amazing. Again, just as a general rule, I'm not saying everything. Um, it has a lot of vulnerabilities. Things like bats and carrion from Tomb Kings even can actually mess these guys up, surprisingly, just because a lot of anti-air is just extremely efficient at dealing with air. So yeah, I'm not gonna put it in strong or anything like that. I'm not gonna do. There'd be a lot of you guys who are like, okay, you're trolling, all that kind of stuff. But a lot of people would say that it's in the weak category. I'm just gonna straight put it in average, just straight up. I think 1 is amazing. I think 2 is where it starts to feel a bit on the weak side. And any more than 2, I do think is weak for a stack. I really do. But I think 1 is actually quite amazing. So that's just my argument. Take it or leave it. I love the Frostworm. I love dragons. I think the Chilling Aura on a fast flying unit that is decent in cycle charging, decent in disruption. I think you should relook and reevaluate the Frostworm. I love that unit. So that's just my take. The Giant. Giant is really good at fighting lords and heroes. Really good at 1v1s with other single entity monsters. Um, you have a bunch of ways to deal with single entity monsters. For 1, 2, giants are missile magnets. Everyone knows this. Even more so than a mammoth is, because mammoths at least are fast. Mammoths can, get out of surrounds, that kind of thing. I mean, if mammoths can just charge the missile line, and can cause a bunch of disruption. The giant oftentimes can't get to the missile line because it just has a hard time getting through infantry, and it just absorbs every single. If you have freaking goblin archers, and they shoot 120 arrows, at the giant, he's gonna take like 100 of those things. I mean, it's just a stupid amount of damage he takes from missiles and functionality. It's hard to make this guy work. He doesn't have. He just doesn't have the resistances, the armor, or the speed to make use of those combat stats. It's like you give this guy a ton of melee attack and weapon strength, and you don't give him any other stat to facilitate that. Now I will say against vampire counts, he's exceptional. Giants of all factions are often used against counts because they have high HP, high leadership, good sustained combat, and they can't be punished with missiles, right? And magic is not that great yet. Using like magic missiles to bring a giant down, it's going to take a while. So, and he could have some applications in the mirror match or Warriors of Chaos because they don't necessarily have a ton of missile play. But I even think it's iffy there because Marauder Horsemasters just mess this guy up. It's not even funny. So I'm going to put him in very weak. The Pharaoh Mammoth is unarmored and rampages. So we're looking at like the Pharaoh Manticore, but he is an incredibly powerful and disruptive force, and significantly tankier at least just because of the high HP pool, and will, unlike the Pharaoh Manticore, who could often just struggle to kill anything when he rampages, the Pharaoh Manticore is taking some people with him. He will at least rampage around, cause a bunch of damage. That being said, the Rampage is definitely a killer. Mammoths, even with their high HP pools, can still get focused down and melted in seconds in this game. I've seen it many times. So, um, for me, the Pharaoh Mammoth is just it's a bit of a liability with that Rampage, and I even have to put it at below average. Now, this is one of the tougher ones to think about are the War Mammoths, because this is just it's kind of like the iconic unit, right? Um, but single entity monsters tend to not be good in player versus player. I'm going to tell you right now, I still think they're in a very strong category. I'm going to tell you why. So, they often will not net as many kills as Berserkers. They often will not net as many kills as Horsemasters or Wolfkin or Familial Balefiends, because this is the first and foremost, the thing that your opponent is generally trying to bring down. Also, your opponent's going to bring elite halberds if they have it. They're going to bring high AP missiles. They're going to bring, everything that they bring is generally good against mammoths, reducing their effectiveness. To me, that is the reason why I put these guys in very strong, because this is the unit that everyone prepares and tries to stop. And because they're so strong, hear me out, because War Mammoths are so strong and everyone brings all the stuff that counters War Mammoths, it facilitates a lot of these other pieces. This is why we bring champions for, the fourth quarter infantry slog. This is why we bring horse masters. This is why we bring, some of our lords and heroes, is because they are facilitated more by the fact that your opponent is so specialized and hyper focused on taking down war mammoths. So, in my experience, they don't do necessarily amazing against other players. But the fact that they bring an entire army basically to stop these guys, I think, is telling. I usually bring, honestly, 3 to 5 is my number. I like the 5-man front. I like having 1 to 2 Norscan Wolves. I like having a Frostworm in there. I like having 3 or 4 Horse Masters. I have Lords and Heroes, right? You start to see where my favorite count come in. I have 2 to 3 Monstrous Infantry. I kind of have a formula with this faction that I found is really freaking solid. And at the end of that is 3 to 5 War Mammoths, which are just absolute powerhouses if they're not dealt with. And I think the fact, like I said, I can't. I think just objectively speaking, you have to acknowledge that the War Mammoth is just very, very defining for this faction, and I think they deserve the very strong, even against players. I'll just talk about the variants real quick. The War Mammoth generic version has a missile attack. The War Shrine gives up the missile attack for the buff of being fire damage, a little bit of just extra damage to a unit, and it has some leadership. So it's just going to do a lot less damage itself because the missile attack ends up amounting to a decent amount. But the buff is actually quite nice. So a lot of times I like to go with 1 War Shrine and the rest just regular War Mammoths. I can't really say that one's objectionably stronger than the other. I mean, you either like the buff, you like the additional micro and that, a little bit extra, or you don't. Maybe you have a preference, maybe not, but to me, they're pretty much on the same tier. The Soul Crusher, obviously the best of all of these, but it is a Regiment of Renown. Has the 40% damage resistance ability that it can just pop, and it's so crucial. Right as your opponent, tries to missile this guy down, you pop that. You're just gonna get, he can still take a ton of damage. I mean, trust me. Like I said, missiles get nutty in this game. Focus fire is brutal, but it's 40% is a big deal, and it's just strictly better. But again, very strong tier. It is a Regiment of Renown, so it's not like we need to really distinguish these guys. Now, they only have 3 heroes and 3 lords, so this will be pretty quick. The Familiar Battlefiend is a monstrous infantry caster. Pretty unique, actually. There's not really anything else like it. I mean, I guess there's the River Troll, but pretty unique class type. Applies armor sundering, is pretty tanky. People will say, well, it's not very mobile compared to the regular caster, right? Because this guy, while he can't fight his way out of a wet paper bag, at least can be put on a chariot or a horse and have some mobility. Mobility is a big deal. It's an interesting argument, but again, I think Norsca is slowly been pushed more towards deathballing, especially this past year. So I think the Familiar Fiend is the better caster. It's a controversial opinion, but that is my opinion. And this is against players. I would say that, and I love the lore of Shadows. Some people aren't that big on it. Personally, I love that lore. Lore of Fire, most people will say is fantastic. So I have no problem putting him in strong. And I'm just gonna put the regular Chaos Sorcerer in average. Yeah, I mean, there's nothing special about him. He's a generic caster. He doesn't bring really any other utility to the field. You can put him on a horse or a chariot. So passable mounts, no flying mount. Nothing else that's particularly special. I mean, he does. All their heroes are good because they can have the Infernal Dominus trait, which is crazy good. But as a caster in and of itself, he's pretty darn average. And the Wolfkin hero, I'll put in above average. Not the best warrior hero in the game. Maybe not even in the top 5, but a pretty darn good one. I would say slightly above average is fair. Certainly better than the likes of like Empire Captains or Paladins. Can't be put on a mount, but does get pretty good combat stats with a decent AP component with regen. Some really good things. And while he doesn't have a mount per se, he has like base speed in the 50s or 60s, so certainly acceptable. Pretty good hero. The Marauder Chieftain, generic Marauder Chieftain, is one of the best warrior lords in the game. For one, he gets a mammoth mount, which is fantastic. For two, he has his personal, gods. One of the 4 lines is the crow, the hound, the eagle, the other one. And all of them are pretty good, really. Sometimes you want that little extra magic resist against, if you're going up against somebody who's just trying to Spirit Leech spam you or bring a lot of magic damage to the field. I think that the Rage passive is really good against dwarves, for example, where you might just want to put this guy on foot so he's a lot more resistant to missiles, and you just want him to be your late game guy to slog down their heroes and lords, because dwarf heroes and lords can be really tough to deal with in the 4th quarter. And that Rage helps, augment that. The missile resistance and regen line is obviously fantastic for a mammoth. It's pretty much like the two of the things that the mammoth wants the most, right? Missile resistance and regen. So he's got really good synergy with himself, with his mounts, his stats, and I think he's actually an above average lord. It sucks that this is the only generic lord that they have. I do think they should be given a Chaos Sorcerer type lord in the future, but at least their generic lord is pretty good. Throg, I'm going to do it. I'm going to put him in very weak. For some reason, he has a cult following of people who love Throg, and the people who love Throg love trolls, and I'm going to tell you that they're all wrong. But no, obviously, play what you like, but I find him to be a terrible lord. He's not good in sustained combat, actually, unless it's a large target. But even then, it's like, oh, well, this guy's specialized in, fighting Kolic, for example. But Kolic just beats the snot out of him. Because Kolic is the anti-large lord, right? He's just a worse version of that. I guess he can deal with other lords who are on large mounts like Karl Franz. But if I'm playing Karl Franz, I'm probably not getting on the Griffin against Norsca, right? That just makes sense. You probably want to be on foot. You're much safer that way. Throg will be less effective in that situation. And you don't really need to be on a Griffin. You don't need to be going around killing missiles or artillery units. So, Throg is just not that good. He buffs pretty much the worst units, you know, to making them passable. That's not good enough for me to put him even in weak tier. Um, and I'm not a fan of him. Some people would disagree. Some people, you know, we've seen all the memes online. You know, Throg's best legendary lord in the game. You know, all this kind of stuff. This is my tier list, my opinions. I don't think Throg is passable at all. Wolfric. Some people would probably say he's strong, but he's also just above average to me. I mean, he is better than the Marauder Chieftain for sure, but not enough to bump him up a tier. Um, he gets a Mammoth mount, which is fantastic, but then the Sword of Tolgog is actually a lot less effective because the Sword of Tolgog buffs base weapon damage. It's not that great on the Mammoth mount, honestly. It ends up being like a really measly bonus. On foot, the Sword of Tolgog is a massive DPS spike, but then you're on foot, right? He also has Hunter of Champions, which is an amazing ability. And then he has Sea Fang, which is not that great. It's not that much damage, and it's pretty dodgeable, really. Its best application is right as the front lines obviously engage, you get kind of a line shot, but even then, a lot of the times it's super dodgeable, and even like a really good Sea Fang is not amazing against elite compositions, you know, and it's terrible against single entities and stuff. So I'm not big on Sea Fang. He's not the best duelist. He loses to Tyrion, he loses to Grimgor, he loses to Archeon. He loses to Mallet. He loses to like 10 different duelist heroes. So to me, that puts him at like above average. But above average is, you know, above average. Like he's still good against a lot of duelists. Like he beats Karl Franz, for example. He, um, with the Hunter of Champions, he can like lock down a caster and go in there and beat the snot out of and stuff. So he's great. He's great in a lot of ways. But to me, I can't put Wolfric up into the strong tier. I can't do it. And I think people think he's good because he's on a really good faction. But imagine if like Norsca had like Tyrion, for example. You'd think much differently about how good Wolfric is. Just saying. You know, I'm trying to compare this to other things. You know. Let me take one final look. Hopefully you learn some things. Most of their units are pretty straightforward, honestly. A lot of times I have like a lot of like niche applications or like specific matchup knowledge. I'm not sure how good I did at explaining some of the more niche things. Hopefully you learned something though, and hopefully you enjoyed this. If you disagreed with certain units, you know, leave it down in the comments below. Be willing to hear your thoughts. One of the cool things about this game is, you know, I have different friends than you. So the metagame that I experience might be different than the metagame you experience. You might say, well, my friends never use missile units. Well, then this tier list would look a lot different for you, you know? You probably wouldn't value Horsemasters that highly, for example. I don't know, just little things like that. You know, I find on online discussions like this, opinions vary wildly because, you know, the type of people that you fight are just so much different. It could be in skill, but it also could just be in playstyle too. So, you know, if some of these units might be, you know, you might be the Throg Troll guy, and maybe it just stomps your friends, and I'm sorry to put them all in very weak like that to you, but, you know, it's just my opinions from what I've experienced. But I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one. See ya.